Rome had no satellites, surveillance cameras, or electronic eavesdropping systems. The state controlled 50 provinces and millions of people without a single cell phone. How could such a vast territory be governed in an era when the fastest means of communication was a mere horse? Most ancient empires simply collapsed due to the loss of control over their distant frontiers. But the Romans solved this complex problem with terrifying brutality and stunning efficiency. Today, we confidently call this method the world's first global intelligence network. Imagine a modern-day CIA, but with iron swords and white togas. It sounds like a funny joke from a cheap historical comic book for teenagers, but the reality was far harsher, bloodier, and on an unimaginable scale. Rome created an intelligence-gathering system that was millennia ahead of its time. This machine detected uprisings long before they began to flare up. Modern intelligence agencies, with their sophisticated algorithms, would certainly envy such remarkable foresight. But here is where the most interesting and unexpected part of this historical mystery begins. The central link in the espionage system was people who were originally engaged in mundane logistics. They were called frumentari, and they were ordinary provisions buyers. Imagine that delivery service couriers suddenly became national security agents. Sounds completely strange, doesn't it? But in pragmatic Rome, it made perfect logical and practical sense. How did logistics workers become the most formidable secret agents of antiquity? The secret lies in their unrestricted access to any roads and cities. No one paid much attention to carts loaded with grain or weary supply workers. They were the perfect, natural cover for gathering secret military intelligence. Modern couriers also know your building's entry code and can see who your guests are. The only difference is that Roman couriers reported this directly to the ruler. In this scenario, we'll dissect the anatomy of Roman intelligence down to the smallest detail. We'll explore the methods of the frumentari and the reasons for their widespread hatred in society. We'll examine this spy network through the eyes of a simple merchant or a powerless household slave. You'll be very surprised at how much modern intelligence agencies have copied the methods of ancient Rome. Prepare yourself thoroughly, because the history of espionage is far darker than the textbooks we're used to. We're about to take a deep dive into the dirtiest secrets of the ancient world. At its peak, the Roman Empire was an unimaginably vast and diverse territory. It stretched from the misty forests of Britain to the scorching sands of the Syrian deserts. Governing such a colossal expanse without the internet seems like an absolutely impossible administrative task. How could an emperor in Rome quickly learn of the Germanic tribes' plans? Usually, news reached the capital only after a barbarian uprising was already in full swing. Rome urgently needed a reliable means of instant warning about new threats. Local provincial governors often deliberately concealed problems from the distant central government. Why did they do this to their own imperial leadership? Because bad news inevitably meant the end of a brilliant career or even execution. The governor naively preferred to deal with the rebellion himself without drawing undue attention from the capital. But more often than not, the situation simply spiraled out of his weak control. And then Rome had to urgently spend millions to deploy entire armies. This is where the main mystery of ancient military and political logistics lies. How could one obtain absolutely reliable information while bypassing corrupt local officials? Emperors needed their own loyal eyes and ears in every province. Moreover, these secret agents had to answer exclusively to the ruler in Rome. Today, large companies hire mystery shoppers to check on the operations of distant branches. The Romans did exactly the same thing, but the stakes were the security of the empire. Your modern, much vaunted big data analytics is nervously smoking on the sidelines. The Romans didn't collect terabytes of junk. They looked only for specific markers of danger. For example, iron prices suddenly skyrocketed in a border province inhabited by barbarians. What does this economic spike tell an experienced analyst in the capital? That's right, local barbarian tribes are mass-producing swords and preparing for an invasion. A swift messenger would immediately be dispatched to Rome with an urgent secret report. Such microscopic signals were far more important than direct denunciations of individuals. Roman analysts sat in the capital and carefully pieced this data together. If grain suddenly stopped arriving from Egypt, it meant a rebellion was brewing there. This is economic intelligence in its purest form, perfected millennia before our time. Today, intelligence agencies track bank transfers by dangerous terrorists using the same principle. The Romans simply tracked the slow movement of carts carrying heavy wheat and metal. But there was one serious problem with open and public sources of information. Market rumors often turned out to be greatly exaggerated or outright and brazenly false. Rome needed a reliable way to verify this data at the state level. There was an urgent need for tough professionals who could travel to the scene and double-check everything. And that's when those very mysterious and sinister frumentari entered the scene. These people forever changed the old rules of the game in the brutal ancient world. The introduction of professional spies was a true culture shock for free Roman society. Suddenly, it turned out that any traveler on the road could be an agent of the emperor. People began to panic at the thought of opening their mouths in a noisy tavern. A heavy atmosphere of paranoia began to slowly but surely spread throughout the great empire. They say that walls have ears, but Roman walls had notebooks. And that is truly frightening, even from the vantage point of our digital age. The system, originally created for the survival of the state, began to take on a life of its own. The more the empire expanded, the more it depended on secret information. A chronic hunger for information drove emperors mad and led to bloody purges. As a result, intelligence became the most important tool for maintaining absolute personal power. Rome finally ceased to be a republic and turned into the police state of antiquity, and it all began with a ruler's simple desire to know the weather at the border. The frumentari were originally just ordinary army procurement officers responsible for sourcing grain for the legions. Their unremarkable name itself comes from the Latin word for common wheat. Their main job consisted of traveling to farms and collecting provisions for the soldiers. Sounds like the most incredibly boring office job in the ancient world, doesn't it? However, it was precisely this dusty routine that made them ideal candidates for secret missions. No one fears a tired guy who's come to buy a couple of sacks of grain. Why did the emperors choose quartermasters specifically to create their powerful secret police? The answer lies entirely in their unique access to the logistics of the entire vast empire. The frumentarii had the legal right to travel on any road and visit any city. They knew the local geography far better than the generals with their inaccurate maps. Moreover, they were in constant contact with the local population regarding their trade affairs. It was an ideal, ready-made covert intelligence network. The transition from purchasing wheat to gathering other secrets occurred very smoothly. At first, the emperors asked the frumentari to simply monitor political sentiments in distant regions. Then they were cautiously instructed to report on the suspicious actions of ambitious governors and military commanders. Soon they began brazenly intercepting letters and spying on influential senators in the capital. The logistics service had, completely unnoticed, mutated into the main intelligence agency of ancient Rome. Today, this is equivalent to delivery couriers becoming Secret Service agents. The empire's population very quickly began to feel a primal terror toward these former logistics officers. Historians describe them as incredibly arrogant people, intoxicated by their absolute impunity. They could brazenly confiscate any personal property, citing the needs of national security. The Frumentari often engaged in outright racketeering and blackmailing citizens for the sake of petty personal gain. Corruption within the ranks of the main intelligence agency reached completely insane and uncontrollable proportions. Absolute secret power corrupts people completely and without exception. Modern historians very often compare the Frumentari to the secret police of brutal dictatorial regimes. And this historical comparison is incredibly accurate in all its grim and bloody details. They created a perfect system of denunciation, where a neighbor could easily turn in his neighbor. People ceased to trust one another forever, even within the closest family circles. A single careless word about the ruler could send you to die in the mines. The empire paid too high a social price every day for its illusory security. The Romans absolutely and deeply hated this organization with all their hearts. There are quite a few known cases where enraged townspeople simply stoned exposed agents to death. But the emperors stubbornly continued to fund the Frumentari because they were totally dependent on their information. Without intelligence, a powerful ruler became a blind kitten in a dark room with hungry wolves. It was a classic, unbreakable, vicious cycle of paranoia, cruelty, and fear. The state could no longer physically survive with them, nor without them. It's amusing to realize how the most ordinary week gave rise to one of the most terrifying secret services. Rome's ingenious innovations often sprang from pure practicality and dull, gray bureaucracy. What began as a mundane record of grain ended in total control over people's thoughts. Modern complex algorithms do roughly the same thing with our digital data. They know exactly what we buy in order to predict what we're thinking. The Romans pulled off this trick brilliantly millennia ago using ordinary carts. While the Frumentari operated within the country, foreign intelligence relied on merchants. Merchants were the only people who regularly and legally crossed the borders of the great empire. They traveled incredibly far beyond Roman territories, trading in amber and silk. To the wild barbarians, a merchant was always a welcome guest, bringing rare and beautiful goods. No one even suspected that this smiling salesman was carefully counting the number of military tents. Rome had turned commerce into its most powerful weapon for gathering tactical intelligence. Why did independent merchants agree to spy for the vast and bureaucratic Roman state in the first place? It had nothing to do with high patriotism, but rather with cold, mathematical profit. The government generously granted informants huge tax breaks and issued exclusive trading licenses. In exchange for a map of the Germanic tribes' locations, a shrewd merchant could secure a monopoly on wine imports. It was an incredibly profitable and stable business, where information was literally exchanged for gold. Modern corporate deals often operate according to exactly the same pragmatic logic. Merchants gathered military intelligence with remarkable meticulousness and a maniacal attention to detail. They carefully noted the condition of forest roads and measured the depth of rivers for future crossings. Merchants kept precise records of exactly what weapons the barbarians were buying and how many horses they had. These small details were critically important for planning future victorious military campaigns. Generals actively used these reports to choose the ideal time and place to strike. The merchants' simple knowledge was converted into the legion's grand historical victories. Sometimes trusted merchants were given special secret assignments to spread mass disinformation among the naive enemy. They deliberately spread terrifying rumors about the incredible numbers of the approaching, invincible Roman legions. The barbarians listened intently to these tales from independent sources and fell into wild panic. This is a classic, textbook example of psychological warfare, brilliantly carried out by others at no cost. A lie, artfully told over a glass of ale, could easily prevent a real, bloody battle. The Romans were unrivaled masters of such cheap manipulations. Of course, this decentralized system also had very serious analytical vulnerabilities. Merchants often greatly embellished their reports to squeeze more money out of Roman officials. They brazenly invented non-existent threats to artificially inflate their own importance in the eyes of the state. Roman analysts had to tediously cross-check this dubious data through other independent channels. This strongly resembles how intelligence agencies today filter through tons of fake news on the internet. The truth was always reliably hidden beneath a thick layer of self-serving lies. The wild barbarians' economic dependence on Roman goods made them incredibly vulnerable. Tribal leaders constantly needed Roman swords, gold jewelry, and wine to maintain their status. They themselves gladly let spies into their capitals for the sake of these coveted luxury items. Trade was the perfect Trojan horse, which the Romans cynically exploited for many centuries. You pay a high price for a beautiful vase, and as a bonus, you get a detailed blueprint for your downfall. It was an absolutely brilliant and ruthless imperial strategy. Today, we cleverly call this open source intelligence. Renowned journalists and business people often gather important data for their governments undercover. The Romans understood this principle perfectly 2,000 years before the Cold War. They turned ordinary greed and commerce into the most reliable weapon of a great empire. Your recent business trip could very well have been a mission for imperial military intelligence. Just think about that the next time you're at a strict customs checkpoint. Religion in ancient Rome was never simply a matter of personal faith or spirituality. It was a powerful state institution, inextricably and firmly linked to high politics. Priests wielded colossal influence over the minds of absolutely everyone, from peasants to senators. Naturally, the pragmatic Imperial Intelligence Service could not pass up such a valuable administrative resource. Ancient temples very quickly turned into ideal centers for gathering political dirt. Hiding from the all-seeing eye of the gods was completely impossible. The state made incredibly active use of these prophecies to ruthlessly manipulate the blind masses. If cunning Rome needed to start a war urgently, the oracles would suddenly issue very favorable predictions. They would proclaim loudly that the gods categorically demanded an immediate attack on a neighboring wealthy kingdom. Public opinion was shaped through unquestionable religious authorities in literally a couple of weeks. Today, cunning politicians use TV talk shows and corrupt bloggers for this purpose. The Romans brilliantly used the entrails of sacrificial animals and the flight of birds for propaganda. Priests in distant provinces played a crucial role as covert agents of influence in conquered territories. They smoothly integrated local gods into the Roman pantheon, psychologically pacifying the aggressive population. But at the same time, they kept incredibly close watch on radical sects and religious fanatics. If a charismatic local prophet began calling for rebellion, he was swiftly and quietly eliminated. Temples served as a kind of secret counter-terrorism hub in the most turbulent outlying regions. Religion gently soothed, but also strictly controlled every move. It sounds wild, but temples were the most reliable safes for storing important legal documents. People left their wills, contracts, and critically important financial receipts there en masse. Naturally, the empire's secret agents had full nighttime access to all these priceless papers. They could easily track the movement of large sums of money belonging to any suspicious politician in the country. This was the ancient equivalent of having your secret bank accounts audited by the tax authorities. It was practically impossible to evade such financial scrutiny, even for the very wealthy. Some ideological priests worked for imperial intelligence, not out of fear, but out of conscience. They believed with absolute sincerity that preserving the integrity of the empire was the will of the great gods themselves. Therefore, turning in a dangerous conspirator was considered a sacred and noble duty for them, not treason. Fanatical devotion to an idea makes a secret agent incredibly effective and absolutely incorruptible. You cannot bribe with gold a person who works for a warm place in paradise. This was the main trump card that clever Rome used for many centuries. Modern political analysts sincerely admire how Rome combined faith and security. It is a stunning example of how a system compels people to voluntarily reveal absolutely everything about themselves. No brutal torture or lengthy interrogations are needed if a person has come forward to confess of their own accord. Today, we voluntarily hand over our data to corporations in exchange for silly filters on social media. The Romans gave up their secrets in exchange for the promise of a good harvest or a victory in court. The essence of human nature has not changed at all in 2,000 years. If you want to know all of a person's dirty secrets, just ask the one who does their laundry. In ancient Rome, the entire massive economy was built on a colossal mass of utterly powerless slaves. They cooked delicious meals, cleaned luxurious homes, transcribed letters, and entertained drunken guests. The aristocrats had long since ceased to view them as human beings, regarding slaves merely as convenient, talking objects. And this arrogance became their most fatal and bloody mistake in the history of the empire. The objects suddenly gained the power of hearing and began to memorize everything very carefully. A slave would silently be present during the most intimate and secret conversations of his influential master. Senators could passionately discuss a state conspiracy right over dinner, while sweet wine was poured for them. It never even occurred to them that a seemingly illiterate servant could perfectly understand the essence of the conversation. It's as if you were discussing a bank robbery with a smart speaker turned on in the living room. Slaves knew absolutely everything about their masters, from shameful diseases to illegal financial schemes. It was a colossal and free database right inside the homes of the Roman nobility. The atmosphere in the vast mansions of the aristocracy gradually became simply psychologically unbearable. Politicians realized with horror that they were tightly surrounded by potential enemies in their own bedrooms. They began frantically speaking in riddles, using codes, and avoiding any politically sensitive topics. Suspected slaves were tortured with incredible cruelty in an attempt to extract confessions of spying against the ruler. But animal fear did not stop the leak of information. It merely made the secret agents more cautious. Paranoia became the most faithful and constant companion of the entire Roman elite. It is interesting to note that Roman law officially and strictly prohibited slaves from testifying against their masters. However, when the matter concerned direct treason against the emperor, all the old laws were miraculously set aside. National security always stood unquestionably above any legal technicalities or ancient traditions. If a servant's denunciation was fully confirmed, the master faced immediate execution, and his vast estate was confiscated. Denunciation became the ideal and quickest way to take revenge on a cruel or greedy owner. It was a true class war, quietly waged in the shadows of magnificent palaces. Modern business competitors very often poach other companies' secretaries or system administrators. They do this solely for the sake of insider information about a competitor's secret plans. The Romans elevated this method of cross-pollinating personnel into an unattainable state absolutism. The entire imperial elite was thoroughly permeated by invisible threads of espionage, from the bottom to the very top. You could rule half the world, but you couldn't trust your own cook or masseur. A funny and very cruel irony of possessing absolutely unlimited power. In the end, this paranoid system brutally devoured itself due to excessive suspicion. No one in the empire felt safe anymore, not even the curators of the powerful intelligence agency themselves. Total surveillance completely destroyed trust within society and critically weakened the state's elite. Information control technology, built entirely on slavery, turned out to be a double-edged sword. Modern advocates of total digital control would do well to study this Roman lesson very carefully. If you're watching everyone, someone is surely already watching you. Intelligence is completely meaningless if information reaches analysts too late. Data about a major uprising, which took a whole month to arrive, becomes a useless and sad historical fact. Rome desperately needed speed that surpassed any known capabilities of ancient logistics at the time. And the astute Emperor Augustus created the Cursus Publicus, a state-run express postal and transport system. It was a true ancient equivalent of fiber optic internet, only powered by live horses, and it forever changed the course of history. The system was a truly massive network of postal stations across the vast empire. The stations were strategically located about a day's arduous journey apart. Each station always had fresh, rested horses, fodder, skilled blacksmiths, and restrooms. A messenger carrying a secret government dispatch would arrive at a station, instantly change horses, and race on. Thanks to this non-stop relay method, the speed of message delivery became simply fantastic. It was a triumph of discipline over geography. An ordinary peacetime traveler in antiquity covered about 30 kilometers in a single long day. Couriers of the imperial secret mail covered up to 200 kilometers in the same 24 hours. They raced frantically day and night, ignoring bad weather, extreme fatigue, and the dangers on the roads. This incredible speed allowed the emperor in Rome to respond to threats in real time. For the first time in human history, a vast continental state was compressed to the size of a few weeks' journey. Space ceased to be the main obstacle to power. It is important to understand that the Cursus Publicus transported far more than just boring letters and orders. Agents, inspectors, and sometimes small, special task forces of liquidators traveled along these same dedicated routes. If a rebellion broke out somewhere, the emperor could instantly deploy his best secret operatives there. They arrived on the scene fresh and ready for battle, while a regular unit would have trudged along for months. This gave Rome a colossal tactical and psychological advantage over any ancient adversary. Speed became the state's most important weapon, but this ideal transport system very quickly developed serious vulnerabilities and corruption problems. Local governors began forging passes en masse to use the postal service for their own personal needs. They brazenly transported heavy luxury items, building materials, and even their mistresses via the system. The stations were quickly depleted, expensive horses died from exhaustion, and important couriers were fatally delayed. Corruption began to slowly but surely eat away at the empire's lifeblood from within. Human greed triumphed over strict instructions. Moreover, Rome's enemies quickly realized the tactical value of these postal stations along the roads. During wars, cunning barbarians targeted these transportation hubs first and foremost. They burned stables, brutally killed couriers, and destroyed bridges, completely blinding imperial intelligence. Protecting the postal routes became the top priority for all Roman border garrisons. An information war was being waged thousands of years before the advent of the first computers and cyber attacks. By cutting off Rome's communications, the barbarians deprived it of its main advantage. Nevertheless, the Cursus Publicus remained forever a marvel of ancient engineering and administrative thought. It clearly demonstrated that information is a real physical force capable of holding an empire together. Without those fast horses and incredibly exhausted couriers, Rome would have collapsed centuries earlier. Today, petabytes of data fly through cables at the bottom of the ocean at the speed of light. But the principle of prioritized and secure government communications was laid down on those very dusty Roman roads. Speed has always been synonymous with victory. Gathering raw intelligence is only half the battle in any good and effective intelligence operation. If you simply pile up thousands of reports, you'll end up with information chaos and a headache. The real magic of espionage begins in the offices where boring people sit with wax tablets. In Rome, there were entire massive departments of analysts whose job was to filter this stream. Storing such a colossal array of data required an extremely complex archiving and indexing system. The Romans used special dry rooms where scrolls were strictly sorted by region, year, and name. If the emperor suddenly asked about a certain senator, the clerks would find his file in a matter of minutes. There, records of his debts, friends, mistresses, and careless drunken remarks were carefully preserved. It was the ancient world's very own paper-based Google, astonishing in its scale. The bureaucracy operated flawlessly and without days off. Economic indicators from rebellious or unstable provinces of the empire were analyzed with particular care and at great length. Experts understood perfectly well that uprisings rarely began simply because of bad philosophical ideas. Usually, a bloody revolt begins when ordinary people have nothing to eat or taxes become unbearable. Analysts closely monitor the prices of bread, olive oil, and the cost of young slaves in the markets. Economic intelligence was their most accurate and reliable tool for political forecasting. Numbers never lied, unlike people. An interesting historical fact: methods of decryption and information security were used very actively in Rome. Cunning generals and spies employed cryptography to prevent enemies from reading intercepted letters. The most famous example is the renowned Caesar cipher, where letters were simply shifted along the alphabet. Analysts had to constantly develop new codes and rack their brains over enemy ciphers. The intellectual games of secret spies were no less intense than actual battles with swords. Minds competed against minds for the right to control the empire. How was this complex information even reported to the emperor himself, who had little time? No one brought him mountains of raw scrolls. That would have been a waste of the ruler's time. The head of the chancellery compiled brief summaries, very similar to the modern morning briefings of the US president. These clearly outlined the essence of the problem, an assessment of the threat level, and proposed options for a bloody solution. All the emperor had to do was say yes or no, based on the perfectly prepared data. The decision-making process was optimized to the utmost. It is important to understand that millions of human lives depended directly on the quality of this quiet analysis. A single error in assessing the enemy's strength led to the shameful destruction of entire armed legions. Therefore, analysts were under immense psychological pressure from the brutal authorities. If they happened to miss a real conspiracy, they were executed along with the conspirators themselves for incompetence. The price of a mistake in this ancient profession was always measured in human blood. It sounds cruel, but that is precisely what kept the system constantly on its toes. Today, the wooden archives of Roman intelligence have survived almost entirely. They were long ago destroyed in fires. We can judge their monumental work only by indirect references from historians of the time. But the effectiveness of this bureaucratic machine is convincingly proven by the very duration of the empire's existence. Rome lasted so incredibly long, not only thanks to the legionnaires' sturdy shields and sharp swords. It survived thanks to very intelligent people who were adept at reading between the lines. Timely information always ruled the ancient world. When astute analysts identified a real threat, it was time to act with extreme speed and severity. The Romans did not always send heavy legions to resolve a political or military problem. Open warfare is too costly, too protracted, and always unpredictable, even for a powerful army. It was far more effective to quietly eliminate the rebel leader before he could gather a crowd around him. For this purpose, there were special secret assassination squads operating under the cover of the Imperial Secret Service. It was a scalpel in the hands of a surgeon, not a butcher's sledgehammer. Psychological pressure was another incredibly powerful weapon in the arsenal of the Roman secret services. Agents could secretly abduct the rebels' family members and hold them in a deeply secret prison. They did not kill valuable hostages, but cold-bloodedly used them for manipulation and bargaining. The leader of the uprising would suddenly change his plans upon receiving a box containing his wife's recognizable ring. This was a dirty, dishonorable, yet incredibly effective tactic that saved the lives of thousands of Roman soldiers. Morality matters little when the survival of the empire is at stake. Sometimes the secret services themselves deliberately provoked controlled riots to identify all the dissidents. Agent provocateurs roamed seedy taverns, loudly calling for the overthrow of the hated regime. When all the radicals and conspirators gathered in one place, the guards simply rounded them up. This classic operational scheme is called a fool's trap, and it still works perfectly to this day. The secret services first artificially create a threat themselves, and then publicly and heroically eliminate it. It's ingenious, cynical, and very effective for career advancement. It's interesting to wonder how the secret services dealt with unruly religious leaders in distant provinces. Killing a popular prophet would mean creating a martyr whose death would provoke an even greater uprising. So the cunning agents took a more subtle approach. They spread vile rumors about the leader's corruption. Discrediting worked far better than any sword, destroying a person's reputation in the eyes of the crowd. Modern black PR specialists use exactly the same methods to destroy political rivals. To kill a person morally is to destroy their very idea. Foreign covert operations very often involve pitting aggressive barbarian tribes against one another. Agents would bring gold to one chieftain and falsely claim that his neighbor was planning to attack him. A bloody internecine massacre would ensue, in which the barbarians happily destroyed one another without Roman intervention. The empire nobly stepped in as a peacemaker once both sides were already bleeding to death. Divide and conquer, this isn't just a nice historical phrase, it's a precise instruction manual. Rome's diplomacy was as steeped in poison as the blades of the assassins. Today, Hollywood movies portray spies as dashing gentlemen in expensive, fashionable suits. The reality of Rome was far bloodier, more down-to-earth, and devoid of any silly romanticism. It was the routine work of butchers, psychologists, and blackmailers dressed in plain gray tunics. They silently did what the senators in the Forum preferred never to know or ask about. Dirty work in the deepest shadows ensured bright sunshine over the entire great empire. National security always reeks of blood and betrayal. Any system, even the most perfect one, eventually begins to rot from within, and Rome was no exception. The intelligence apparatus, originally created to protect the empire, gradually became its greatest threat. The instrument of absolute control turned into an independent monster that ceased to obey its creators. The Frumentarii quickly realized that whoever truly controlled information controlled the entire world, and they decided to use this power exclusively for their own boundless enrichment. The defenders turned into looters. Weak emperors suddenly found themselves held hostage by their own powerful secret police. They could not disband the Frumentarii because they were terrified of assassination attempts by them. The spies knew absolutely every secret passage in the palace and every weakness of the emperor's personal guard. Intelligence began secretly appointing and deposing emperors on its own, playing the Game of Thrones by its own rules. The tail began to wag the massive dog with terrifying cruelty and absolute impunity. The emperor became a puppet in the hands of those who read other people's letters. Public sentiment reached a boiling point. The exhausted provinces were ready to explode with hatred. It got to the point where residents of peaceful towns would hide in the woods at the approach of imperial couriers. The appearance of a secret agent always meant new taxes, false accusations, or mass arrests without cause. The information drought gave way to paranoia, and paranoia led to the complete social collapse of society. Roman intelligence became the primary symbol of oppression rather than a guarantor of the promised public safety. Trust in the authorities plummeted to absolute zero. As a result, the powerful emperor Diocletian made a very radical decision at the end of the 3rd century. He completely and irrevocably abolished the Frumentarii service, dissolving their headquarters and destroying their archives. It was a desperate attempt to reset the system and restore the population's trust in the central government. The joy of the common people was boundless. They celebrated the disappearance of the hated spies for weeks on end. It seemed that the dark era of total surveillance and state terror was forever a thing of the past. People could once again speak freely in taverns, but a vast state cannot exist without eyes and ears. It is physically impossible. After a very short time, an entirely new intelligence agency was created under a different name. The new name translates simply as People Who Handle Affairs, which sounds even more ominous and obscure. The government attempted to reform the old structure, making it more transparent and accountable to the law. But history has a nasty habit of repeating itself with frightening and inevitable regularity. The vices of human nature cannot be eradicated by decrees. This historical failure has become a classic case study for modern political scientists and administrators. Unchecked secret intelligence always mutates into a closed caste working solely for its own personal interests. The absence of strict checks and balances is absolutely disastrous for any national security system. If you grant someone absolute secret power, be prepared to become its first victim. The Romans learned this painful lesson too late, paying for it with a sea of blood. Their mistake became a textbook for future generations. The collapse of the Roman intelligence system coincided entirely with the general decline of the greatest empire. When the center ceased to receive reliable information, the peripheries began to break away rapidly and bloodily. Barbarians easily breached the borders, which no one in the capital was left to control or analyze. The great information machine rusted and fell apart along with the collapsed state. The darkness of ignorance engulfed Europe for centuries to come after the fall of Rome. A blind empire could not survive in a world of sighted enemies. Maintaining such a colossal spy network required simply astronomical budgets from the state treasury. The Romans could not simply print paper money when they lacked funds for special operations. Every coin was backed by real silver or gold, collected in the form of heavy taxes. Therefore, the extravagant funding of the secret police often led to severe economic crises. The empire's economy periodically buckled under the strain of the imperial intelligence service's insatiable appetite. Spies cost the treasury more than the legions. The salaries of professional secret agents exceeded the incomes of ordinary frontline legionnaires many times over. They were also constantly allocated huge sums for so-called operational expenses in the provinces. This included money for bribing the necessary officials, renting inns, and purchasing fast horses. No one ever demanded strict accounting records with receipts and seals from the agents. Gold flowed through their fingers, settling in the bottomless pockets of the secret operatives. Corruption was built into the very financial model of this organization. The financial independence of the secret services made them virtually uncontrollable, even by some Roman emperors. When an agency can easily generate its own funds, it ceases to heed orders from the political center. Agents began to operate like a true mafia cartel, collecting tribute from the rich and prosperous provinces. Local governors often paid spies simply to keep them from reporting on them. Extortion became an official, albeit deeply secret, instrument of domestic state policy. The power of money triumphed over the rule of law. It is interesting to examine the complex logistics of these shadow financial flows within a vast empire. Transporting tons of gold along extremely dangerous roads was foolish and far too risky for the agents. Therefore, intelligence actively utilized a system of ancient banknotes and secret promissory notes. An agent could deposit money in one city and easily retrieve it in another from the right person. The Templars would reinvent this system 1,000 years after the final fall of Rome. The Romans were pioneers of offshore financial transfers. Secret state treasuries were very often disguised as religious donations to major temples. Priests laundered dirty spy money by passing it through the temple's accounting as gifts to the gods. These clean funds were then used to pay informants or organize political assassinations. Religion and dirty espionage merged into a single, incredibly profitable, and utterly cynical symbiosis. It was physically impossible for ordinary auditors to trace the real ends of this ancient offshore scheme, the perfect cover for the empire's shadow budgets. Modern investigators are often surprised by the slush funds of dictatorial regimes or major drug cartels. But all these complex financial schemes were first tested on the shores of the warm Mediterranean Sea. The Romans knew how to hide money just as masterfully as they hid the political corpses of their numerous enemies. Secret power always requires secret money. This is an immutable law of every bureaucracy in the world. And Rome brought this unspoken law to absolute mathematical perfection. Money loves silence, and spy money loves the silence of the grave. Ultimately, the incredible economic burden of surveillance became simply unbearable for the common people. Peasants abandoned their lands en masse because they could not pay the taxes required to maintain the apparatus. The economy began to collapse rapidly, depriving the empire of the basic resources for its physical survival. The insane spending on security paradoxically destroyed the very security of the great state. This is a bitter economic lesson that politicians often forget. Even in the 21st century, you cannot build a wall of security if there is no one to pay for it. The financial history of Roman intelligence is a grim chronicle of unchecked greed and absolute power. The very instrument that was supposed to save money on wars quickly became a financial black hole itself. It devoured resources at such an alarming rate that it completely bled dry the once great power. Sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Bloated intelligence agency budgets often become the very gravediggers of the very empires they swore to defend. History does not forgive those who spend more than they earn. The history of Roman intelligence is not just dusty chronicles of a long-forgotten ancient empire. It is a distorting mirror in which absolutely all modern methods of state control are reflected. We naively think that we live in a unique era of digital technologies and smart neural networks. But in reality, we are simply using new tools for very old Roman tricks. Human psychology has not changed one iota since the time of Gaius Julius Caesar. We are just as vulnerable to manipulation as we were 2,000 years ago. And herein lies the most significant and absurd irony of this entire long historical retrospective. We are deeply frightened by stories of the secret Roman police and the incredible brutality of their methods. Yet at the same time, we gladly trade our secrets for access to a free new messaging app. At least a Roman senator understood that his political enemies could be eavesdropping on him around the clock. Modern people often don't even think about who is reading their messages right now. We have become too careless with our personal boundaries in the digital world. The history of intelligence is an eternal and fascinating game of cat and mouse between the state and the individual. By studying brutal Rome, we gain a much better understanding of the harsh rules of the game in our own world. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new analyses of the hidden mechanisms of human history. Leave comments if you've noticed Rome's espionage methods in modern corporate or office culture. See you in the next videos, and always remember, the walls always have very attentive ears.